How's it going today, YouTube, and welcome back to Shaner's Mechanic Life. Well, I got given a snowblower here that needs a little bit of work. Now, I was told it doesn't run, but last time they shut it off, it was running. The only thing they said was something wrong with the switch here. Because when you have it to run, it would run fine. When you go to shut it off, it would take forever to shut off. And the primer button here is just dried out and rotted out. And whether you like it or not, winter's here. And if you got a snowblower, it's time to get it running and make sure it's going to start and run when you need it. So I'm going to go over this one, fix it up, get it running, and show you some things you can do on your own snowblower to get it ready for winter. Well, here we go. So first thing you want to do, just give it a visual inspection. Make sure everything's there. As you can see, this cover's loose, primer button's dried out, and like I previously said, they're complaining about the ignition switch. And also, you want to give the engine a pull. Make sure it's not seized up, because if the motor's seized, well, you got bigger problems. So one of the first things I do when I have a piece of equipment that's been sitting for a couple seasons is make sure you get a tank of fresh gas and even a new spark plug. You'd be surprised how many problems are caused by old gas or a bad spark plug. You also want to check to see what kind of gas this thing takes. This is a 2-stroke engine, so you have to have gas and add oil at the proper ratio. This one just happens to be 50-to-1. So it's 50 parts of gasoline and 1 part of oil. I picked this up off of Amazon. How it works is when you're mixing gas and oil, you just look in the manual, see what ratio it takes. This one's 50-to-1, and for every liter or gallon of gas, you fill up your 2-stroke mix to the line. That way, you make sure it's mixed right the first time, and your engine's going to run at top performance. I'll leave a link to this in the description of the video if you want to check it out. Okay, I got my gas tank filled up. It was empty. I usually drain them. Make sure you get fresh gas in there. As you can see, usually the cap will tell you what the ratio of the oil is. Okay, next, since we know we have problems, I'm going to undo these screws. One here, one there, and one there. I'm going to remove this cover, and we're going to take a look on the inside and see what we find. Okay, so I'll just rattle our screws out here. I always put them in a magnetic tray. That way you don't lose them. You never know when you're going to get called away to do something else. Okay, take your cover off. And now you can see the bottom of the fuel tank, the fuel line, our carburetor, and our choke lever. So again, give everything a visual. Here's the hose going to this primer button. That's even broken off the back. Check your fuel line. With it being a rubber hose, you want to make sure there's no cracks or anything, because the last thing you want to do is break that and dump gasoline all over your driveway. Now next, take a look for any visual damage. We can see we've got a crack here. Well, it looks like this motor's rattled loose, so we're gonna have to dig a little deeper and look to see if we have missing or loose bolts. Now also, check your air filter. This one doesn't happen to have one, but if you do have an air filter, you got to make sure that's nice and clean, or even just put a new one in. And make sure everything's securely mounted. Just from it shaking, this carburetor's loose. So we're going to try tightening the bolts. But anytime you take these gaskets off, you want to make sure you put new ones on. After all, you're dealing with fuel. You don't want to have any leaks. So I undid these nuts and bolts, pulled this cover back, and I found all sorts of nuts and bolts. That is probably the reason why our motor is rattling loose. Now to find out where they go. So in a matter of a short couple minutes, we've gone from a what was supposed to be a fully functioning snowblower that just needed a primer button and some ignition switch work to something that's been rattling the bolts loose for quite some time. So to get to and repair all this, we're gonna have to take this top cover off as well as the discharge chute. So getting this top cover and chute off doesn't look too bad. We're gonna have to remove our fuel cap to get the cover over. Undo the bolts holding the top part of the chute on. Take off these two front screws and it should lift right off. So I've undone the 3 bolts that hold the chute on. I always put the nuts and washers and everything back on. Store it in your tray so you don't lose it. And it just lifts right off. Okay, I got the screws out. They actually had the nylon locking nuts on the back side of it, which for something like this is quite common. There's a lot of vibration, so the last thing you want to do is have everything rattle loose on you. Now at this point, you might start getting a little bit discouraged. This thing needs a lot of work. It's in pretty rough shape. But just think, all I've got into it so far is the cost of a gallon of gas and a little bit of 2-stroke oil. So provided we don't have any major engine issues, I think this is worth putting a little bit of time into. So we're going to keep on going. So now that our front's all disconnected, we got a little bit of work to do back here to get that cover off. Like disconnect this ignition switch. Just pull it undone. And now we've got our pull cable. Now I'm not going to take that right out. What I'm going to do, I'm going to pull the cable all the way out. And I'm going to just pinch the rope here so it doesn't retract. That way we got the full length of the cable to move this cover out of the way. So now we can take this cover out of the way. That can stay on the rope as well. Take your fuel cap off, and this cover should lift right off. Feed that through there. Put your fuel cap back on. Now we can get the rest of it. Okay, so I'm slowly finding homes for these bolts that were in that cover when we undid it. Like these 4. That's what holds this plate and holds your motor in place. As you can see, she's flopping around pretty good because there's nothing holding it in. So we'll put those bolts in. And I looked at the threads. From what I can see, none of the threads are stripped out, nothing's broken off, they just rattled loose. Now another problem I found is with this fuel tank. I filled that tank up to the top 24 hours ago. We're losing gas someplace. You can see a little bit of a leak at the bottom of the carburetor. But you look at the bottom of the engine there, there's that cover. There's no shutoff on this fuel line. It just runs into the carburetor, and there's a needle valve and seat that when the float goes up, it'll shut the flow of fuel off. There's a problem inside there. But with the carburetor being loose, the leak at the bottom, looks like there's a leak around here. I wouldn't even think about opening up this carburetor unless you got a full gasket kit. As well as we can see, this fuel line's a little bit dry rotted. So we're going to replace that length of fuel line as well. So now it's time to write down your model number, serial number, and I'm going to get online and see what we can find for parts. So we're going to need this primer button, some fuel line, which I'll be able to get local. I'm going to price out a gasket kit or a rebuild kit for this carburetor, but time wise and cost wise it might be cheaper just to buy a new carb. We'll see what's available online. And I've already looked in the manual. I've already got a spark plug for it, and since we're in here, we might as well get a new belt for it as well. Well, I'm going to track down some parts and then we'll be back. Okay, so I pulled the carburetor off here so I can try to match something up. When you look at this bottom cover, we got a leak there too. I think gasoline's bypassing going through the carburetor right in and hanging out in the crankcase. So we're gonna have to reseal the bottom, repair or replace the carburetor, and due to the fact that we're having issues with it shutting off, we're gonna have to get into here. Now, with those bolts already being out, because they rattled out, we've only got one bolt left, or one nut left. We can pull this motor right out of there. That way we can get it on the bench and get good access to everything and do a proper job. But I'll tell you right now, spend a little bit of money on a carburetor, belt, and some time is definitely a lot better than having to shovel snow using a snow shovel. I have full intentions when the snow starts flying to be pushing this around my driveway. Okay, so I found the carburetor we're looking for on Amazon here for the Toro CCR 1000, and that's our model number here, the 38191. Only 8 in stock. Okay, so I used the impact wrench, pulled this off, so we gotta pull this whole motor out to fix it. Got the nut off the shaft, and then you gotta take these brackets out and then pull our motor out. Okay, so now that I got the fuel tank out of the way, you can see what I'm talking about a little bit better. All we got left, these two nuts and bolts, that bracket off, and our motor will pull straight through this housing. Now we take the bracket off. Lift our motor right out. Okay, we got the motor sitting on the floor now. That's where the carburetor mounts. And this is the cover I was telling you. At the bottom, we're gonna have to reseal that. That's leaking. That crankcase is probably just getting full of gas and oil mix. So we'll open this up, see if it's either a gasket or it might just be a silicone seal. Either way, we'll get her fixed up. Well, to tell you the truth, I thought this was just going to be a quick little how to get your snowblower ready for winter. That's basically turned into a little bit more than that, as you can see. Just goes to show you how sometimes a small little job can go spiraling out of control rather quickly. But you just take one step at a time, one problem at a time, figure out a solution, and move on to the next step. Now we've got the cover off, you can see our ignition coil. And here is the wiring that turns your ignition off when you turn the key. I don't see anything obvious. Now when you turn that key, what it does is it grounds this out, and then your coil will stop producing spark and your engine will shut off. It's pretty straightforward, but what I'm thinking was going on was this motor was so loose and this was grounded towards one of the handles on the snowblower. It just may not have been good enough continuity between all the loose bolts on this and the handle to complete that circuit. So now I'm going to pull this bottom cover off. We'll clean everything off. We'll make a new gasket and we'll reseal it So that way we know we're not going to have any more leaks. The bolts weren't very tight, so I think that may have been part of our problem. But with the silicone on this, even though we got the bolts out, this cover doesn't want to come off. So we'll try giving it a little tap with just a little plastic mallet. There we go. That broke the seal. Yeah, we got lots of silicone here. And you pull it off, you can see here, at one time there was a gasket. So somebody tried to reseal this just by smearing some silicone on it. Now in general, what you want to do is either seal it with a gasket or silicone, not both. A lot of times when you use both, you'll have the gasket, and the silicone will actually act as a lubricant. When you tighten it down, it'll push your gasket out. Not to mention, if you don't clean it off, you're not going to have a nice smooth surface for it to seal against anyway. So we're going to go ahead, take all this stuff off, clean it up nice, and then I'll show you how to make a new gasket. So now just take your time, get all that junk scraped off of there, and as far as the cover, scrape it all off. And what you want to look for is make sure it's not bent. So usually get like a small straight edge or something. Just make sure it's nice and straight. Now rather than order this gasket, I'm actually going to make it. And I'm going to show you something I always keep in my toolbox. It's made by Felpro, part number 3060. You can get it off Amazon as well. I'll leave a link to it in the description of this video. What it is, it comes with 4 sheets of gasket material. It comes with 2 pieces of cork, a piece of rubber cellulose, which is the blue, which you use for water and coolant, and a piece of the rubber fiber, which is good for oil, coolant, and gasoline. So we're going to be using this to make our gasket. Now, as you can see, we don't exactly have a smooth surface to lay down and trace. So I'm going to show you a little trick you can do. Here we go. So after I'm done manually scraping off the majority of the gasket material, I usually take a little piece of sandpaper or something like the sanding sponge. Just run that over the surface. That way it gets all the little bits. That way you know your new gasket's going to have a nice surface to seal against. And chances are you're not going to have any leaks. And same thing as with the cover. Scrape off what you can. And just sand the rest of it. You know, you start using like buffing wheel or stuff like that, you end up removing quite a bit of material, and you can actually warp the housing, which is the last thing you want. So instead of holding the whole sheet of gasket material up around there, I usually just trace out the cover, get your piece of gasket material just a little bit bigger, and then you can tape it on. That way you know it holds steady and you get a nice good line all the way around. So I just take the factory edge of your gasket material, line it up, get a piece of masking tape or duct tape or something, put it on, push it down securely. That way it holds it in place while you trace it. And you just take a permanent marker and trace around the block. Making sure you get all the corners and stuff. That way you get a nice looking edge. So once you're done tracing around it, you can go ahead and pull it off and get yourself a nice little template there. Now you got to remember when you go to cut this out and trace the other side that this is actually that way. So what I'm going to do first is go ahead, cut out around the perimeter, and then trace out the rest of our lines. Now to do that, you can use a razor blade, or even what I find works well, just a small pair of scissors. It's kind of like arts and crafts time now, isn't it? Take your tape off and start cutting. Just follow the line. Okay, so now that you cut it out, Match it up, make sure you got the right shape. This looks good. Now we can go ahead and trace out our inside line. I'm going to use this to get myself a little bit more of a reference point. I'm going to put the gasket on the outside. As you can see, it fits the contours. I'm going to flip it over and just mark my holes. That way, you can get a good reference on these lines. Or if you want to get a perfect match, get a little paint, put in the cap of something, and just dab the paint on your gasket surface. If you work quick enough, you can get it before it dries. And then you just press your gasket material up against it, and it'll trace these lines absolutely perfect. Doesn't matter if you have a little bit of run, that's fine. Get your gasket material, nice steady hand, press it up, hold it for a second, and make sure you press around the perimeter and pull it straight off. And you can see a nice sharp line. It might be hard to pick it up, but you can see it all the way around. You get your permanent marker, trace that out, and start cutting with a razor blade. There you go. Just take your time, trace it out. It's almost like a factory gasket. Now just take your time with a nice sharp razor, and again just follow the line. Now you might have to go around a few times to make sure you get all the bits and pieces, but there we go. Now I'm just going to show you how to punch holes. Now instead of trying to use a knife and cut a round small hole in your gasket, it's not going to turn out too well, you can get these pretty cheap. They're gasket punches. What they are, you can see that one's been used a couple times. Little punches. You hit them with a hammer and it'll just punch a nice hole right through the gasket surface. So what you want to do, grab your bolt, find a gasket punch that matches it, and you can put it over your gasket and just give it a tap. It'll cut a hole right through. If you're interested, I'll leave a link to something like this on Amazon. Quite a handy little set to have. I usually get a punch that's just slightly bigger. That way it gives you just a little bit of wiggle room, but you don't want to go too big. So then all you do is line it up to the holes that you previously marked. Grab your hammer, put on a bench, preferably wood that you don't mind marring up a little bit, and just give it a tap. If it doesn't go through, just do it again. There you go. You get a perfect hole with plenty of gasket material around to seal up. Now just repeat the process to the other three. You can scrape off or wipe off the excess paint, and you're ready to install your gasket. There we go. They're all punched out. Now, the bits of gasket will pile up inside of there. So if you got a whole bunch of holes to punch, you can just do them one after another and then clean all the bits and pieces out after. But before you go ahead and try to bolt it all on, just put it on and eyeball it. Make sure everything looks right. And we also fit nice here. Just got to watch out for these. If you went too big with a gasket, it would interfere with getting that plate on right. One thing I find that makes installing small gaskets easier is start your bolts first, like something like that. That way you don't have to try to line everything up in one shot. Just put it on there. Just start your bolts by fingers, and you can get your socket and go along and tighten them down. So now I'll just take it off the carburetor, and we'll open it up and match it up with the one we got off of Amazon. To tell you the truth, I've never bought a carburetor off of Amazon, so I'm kind of trying it for the first time along with you guys here. So hopefully it's the same, hopefully it works, and hopefully it doesn't leak. We want to make sure too is all these little levers and springs, you don't want to lose them, because chances are you're not going to be able to find those. Okay, carburetor's off. So you open it up, it's got, comes with gaskets, our carburetor, and first impressions, everything looks right here. I'll have to move this over. I always look every side, every angle. You don't want to find out it's wrong after you get it on. But so far I think we're in good shape. So we got a couple little brackets to move over this cover, and well, go ahead and bolt it on. So now we got our new gaskets on, our spring and brackets switched over, and our bolts. You go ahead and bolt it on, but you don't want to forget about this big piece of linkage that we took off previously. So get that in place, and start your bolts, and you can go ahead and snug them down. So once you get your carburetor on, just make sure your linkage and everything moves freely, doesn't bind. Everything seems to work the way it should. Now you can go ahead and put your cover on, and we're ready to put this motor back in. But first, we gotta put our cover back on. Just strap the bolts. Like I said earlier, this part where it's broken out, I'm just going to use a bit of a fender washer on there to span the difference. Whenever I'm doing something like this, starting multiple bolts, I don't tighten them down until everything's in and started. That way you know everything's going to line up nicely. Well, now it's time to put everything back together again. So assembly is basically just to reverse a disassembly. Tighten down these bracket bolts again, as well as the 4 bolts to hold your motor on. You can go ahead and put your pulley back on. Go ahead and put your belt back on, and then you can put your cover on. Make sure you get all your cover bolts tightened down. Then you can go ahead and mount up our fuel tank and bracket. Now that our fuel tank is bolted on, we're going to go ahead and change out this dry rotted fuel line. Now when you get your hose for the fuel line, you want to make sure it is actual fuel rated hose, or else it'll just deteriorate really quickly and then fail. Now I'm going to try hooking up our ground for the ignition to the same point as it was before, because I think the whole problem we weren't grounding out was all these mount bolts were just loose and it didn't have continuity. Put our cover back on. And next, we're going to feed our pull cable through the hole here, through the handle, and tie it off. Now, whenever I get a piece of equipment ready for a season, I always put a fresh spark plug in. Make sure you get the right plug and gap it to the specification found in the manual. I find these little spark plug gappers quite handy. I'll put a link to something very similar in the description of this video if you're interested. Next, we're going to put our new primer button on. As you remember, the old one was just rotted right out. This will help get us started. So you just pull the hose off. This clips on there, and you just push the hose on the backside and down to the line on the carburetor. As you can see, those just push through and clip in. And just hook up the hose to the back of it, and we're on to the next step. Now before you go putting the bottom cover on, I always fill it up with fuel. Double check, make sure you've got no leaks. Then we're all dry around the hose, all our gaskets. Everything seems good. So now, put our discharge chute on, bolt it down, and we're one more step closer to blowing snow. And tighten down your bolts. Make sure everything moves. And we're good to go. And put your back cover on. We'll put our screws in and tighten them down. Okay, well, what do you think? Are we going to be pushing a snowblower, or are we going to be shoveling snow with a regular shovel? Let's try it. Turn the ignition on. Give our primer a few presses. Now that carburetor's been dry and it hasn't run in a while, so I'll give it a few. Turn our choke to on. Now this may take a few pulls, but let's hope for the best. And our key works. Well, as everybody can see, I made it just in the nick of time. Got everything together just as the snow hit. Hope you found this video helpful, informative, and entertaining. And just off the top of my head, between spark plug, carburetor, primer button, and a little bit of fuel, I'm into the snowblower for, I'd say, about $60. Which is definitely worth the price. Because really, if you got a chance to use a snowblower rather than shoveling it by hand, what would you choose? Let me know what you think in the comments section. Just want to end the video by thanking one of the viewers that left a comment in a previous video, Mitchell Leggins. Thanks for the comment. Really appreciate it. Well, if you like this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more like it, hit the subscribe button and notification bell. That way you get notified when I get new videos coming out. Well, that's it for tonight, everybody. Have a good night, and thanks for watching.